Sweden's most haunted mines.
Tonight, we leave the daylight behind to descend into the deepest, darkest holes ever dug into Swedish soil. We are visiting two places where the silence is not just absolute, but directly threatening. Two locations that for centuries formed the backbone of the Swedish realm, but which hide secrets so dark they should never have seen the light of day. Imagine being hundreds of meters below the surface. Above you rest millions of tons of rock, and around you wind dark passages that have seen more suffering than we can ever comprehend. Here, generations of men worked, suffered, and died in the hunt for silver and copper. But death down here does not seem to be the end. It is said that the mountain has a memory, that the walls have soaked up the last desperate breaths of those left behind in the darkness. Down here, where the boundary between our world and the other is as thin as a candle's flame, they still wander. Mine wives warning of coming catastrophes, vanished men who never age, and figures who refuse to leave their shifts even though centuries have passed. These are environments where logic ceases and where fear is as tangible as the damp air. Are you ready to meet what lurks beneath our feet? Hold on tight, because now we journey down into Sweden's most haunted mines. Welcome to Bedtime Chillers. Before we visit the first mine, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment if you appreciate what I do. It helps the channel a lot. We find ourselves at the Sala silver mine. For over 500 years, man has burrowed into this mountain. Silver, worth billions, has been extracted. But the price has not only been counted in coins, it has been paid in lives. And when a life is extinguished in a cold, damp mine shaft several hundred meters below the day, it is said that the soul never truly finds its way out. The story of Sala silver mine begins with enormous wealth, but it hides a daily reality of unspeakable dread. Imagine the 16th century. The only thing lighting the narrow passages is flickering tallow candles. The smoke from fire setting, where large bonfires were built against the rock to crack the stone, lay thick and toxic. Workers breathed in soot and sulfur day in and day out. Many did not live past 30. They died of consumption, were crushed under rockfalls, or fell headlong into bottomless shafts when their exhausted hands lost their grip on wet rope ladders. It is in this environment of suffering that these phenomena were born. Let's talk about the mine wife, Frun. She is not a fairy tale, she is a reality for those who work here. For centuries, miners have feared her wrath. The testimonies are countless. It is said she appears as a woman in dark, archaic clothing, but her face is often hidden in shadow. An old tale from the 1800s speaks of a miner who defied the ban on whistling in the mine. He laughed at the superstition and whistled a cheerful tune while working alone in a drift. Suddenly, his light went out. In the total darkness, he heard a freezing female voice whisper directly into his ear. "Here I sing, here you work." The man was later found trembling with terror, unable to ever return to the mountain. Even today, guides and visitors report inexplicable events that defy all logic. One of the most psychologically taxing places in the entire mine system is the Victoria Hall, located on the desolate 155-meter level. Although the hall is used today for festivities and concerts, it seems to carry an energy that does not want company. There are documented testimonies from experienced guides who, while preparing for visitors, experienced the room suddenly changing. They carefully set out rows of chairs and lit dozens of candles to create an atmosphere, only to leave the hall for a few short minutes to fetch a group. When they return, they are met with a sight that turns their blood to ice. Heavy chairs have been overturned or arranged in unnatural patterns, and every single candle flame has been extinguished simultaneously, even though the air in the mine is completely still and no other person has been on that level. But the physical discomfort in the Victoria Hall doesn't stop at moved furniture. Several people have testified to a specific icy sensation that starts at the neck and spreads down the spine. Most terrifying are the reports from those who have stood near the deep shafts. They describe how an invisible, powerful hand was suddenly placed between their shoulder blades and gave them a resolute shove toward the edge. It is a physical aggression that leaves the victims shaking for hours afterward. Some believe it is the mine wife attempting one final warning to show that human presence down here is unwanted, that we are disturbing the eternal rest the dead deserve. Others, more skeptical but deeply shaken, ask a darker question. Is what we experience not a warning, but an attempt at recruitment? Does she want us to step over the edge, fall through the darkness, and join the thousands of perished workers in the bottomless silence at the bottom of the mine? One thing is certain. In the Victoria Hall, you are never as alone as you think, and the darkness watching you from there has a very concrete and dangerous will. Then we have the story of White Karin, a tale that begins in bottomless sorrow but has transformed into one of the most persistent hauntings in Swedish history. It is a story that touches the soul, but also evokes the coldest shivers when you realize her waiting has never ended. Karin was a young woman in 18th century Sala whose whole world revolved around her fiancé. They stood on the threshold of their new life, and the wedding was only days away when the mountain claimed its tribute. A massive, deafening collapse deep in the mine buried the entire crew where her husband-to-be was working. But the collapse was so extensive and unstable that the bodies could never be recovered. They remained down there, swallowed by the stone. Karin refused to accept he was gone. Grief broke her mind, and she lost her grip on reality. Every day, come rain or shine, she dressed in her pure white wedding gown and walked with heavy steps to the edge of the mine opening. There she stood, like a pale statue, calling his name. Down into the echoing shafts, over and over, hoping for an answer from the dark. Finally, her body gave out. She died alone, wasted by grief and biting cold, her gaze still fixed on the black depths. But death seems not to have brought her peace. Today, visitors and staff regularly report a white, almost transparent figure floating through the upper passages, as if she is still searching for an entrance to her beloved. One of the most shocking modern testimonies comes from a night watchman patrolling the mine area just a few years ago. He spotted a woman in a wide white dress moving with unnaturally steady steps toward one of the cordoned-off and lethal shafts. The guard, thinking it was a lost tourist or someone attempting suicide, screamed desperately for her to stop and began to run as fast as he could. But the woman neither stopped nor turned around. She continued to the edge and stepped without hesitation straight into the void. The guard threw himself to the edge, prepared to hear a crushed scream or the sound of a body hitting the bottom hundreds of meters down. But the silence was total. When he shone his powerful flashlight down the shaft, there was nothing. No body, no dust, no movement. The only thing that lingered in the otherwise dry and dusty mine air was a stale, heavy scent of old, rotting funeral flowers, a scent that stayed in his clothes long after he had fled the scene. Karin is still waiting, and she doesn't seem to care who happens to cross her path in the darkness. But it doesn't stop at apparitions. It is the sounds that break down the psyche of those who stay down here too long. The mine lives. Visitors on the 155-meter level have reported the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps approaching from behind in the narrow drifts. When they turn around, no one is there, but the sound continues past them. Others have heard the distinct sound of a pickaxe against stone, even though all work in the mine ceased long ago. It is as if history is replaying itself over and over, like a paranormal echo of those who toiled here until their hearts stopped beating. One of the most haunted parts is said to be the Knight's Shaft, Nekchuktet. There, people have reported an intense feeling of being watched, a feeling so strong it causes physical nausea. Some claim to have seen shadow beings, black figures darker than the mine darkness itself, moving along the walls with unnatural speed. These shadow men are said to be those who died in solitude, forgotten by the world above. Sala silver mine is a beautiful but deadly labyrinth. Every time you step into the elevator, you leave the safe world behind. You enter a realm where the laws of time and space seem to blur. Remember, if you ever visit these depths, be quiet. Show respect for the mountain. Because if you hear a faint tapping from the other side of the rock wall, it isn't a stone coming loose. It is someone wanting to remind you that you are only a guest in their eternal prison. Now we shall head to a place that for centuries was Sweden's beating heart, but which was also a gateway to an underground hell. We are going to the Falun copper mine. This is not just a hole in the ground, it is a monument to human greed, inhuman toil, and the dark powers said to guard the ore. Here, in the shadow of the enormous Great Pit, Stora Sturten, the walls whisper of the thousands of souls sacrificed for the red metal. The history of the Falun mine is soaked in blood. During its glory days, conditions were vile. Workers were lowered in barrels into the deep shafts, surrounded by sulfur smoke so thick you could barely see your hand. Accidents were common. Collapses, falls, and suffocation claimed lives every week. It is said that the ground around the mine was so poisoned that no flowers could grow, and that birds fell dead from the sky if they flew too close to the smoking smelters. But what happened in the depths was even worse. The most famous, and undoubtedly the most macabre testimony from Falun, concerns Fat Mats, or Mats Israelsson, the man time forgot. In 1719, when miners broke into the water-filled Morten Skinneret shaft, which had been untouched for decades, they made a discovery that stopped their hearts. There, deep in the dark, they found the body of a young man. But it was no decayed remnant. The man looked as if he had just taken his last breath. His skin was soft and elastic, his features were peaceful, and his work clothes were so well preserved they looked like they had been put on that same morning. Confusion was total. No one in the mine recognized the young man, even though the mining community was small. It was only when a frail, old woman named Margaret Olsdotter was led to the site that the terrifying truth was revealed. With a heart-wrenching scream that echoed between the stone walls, she fell to her knees by the dead man. It was her fiancé, Mats, who had vanished without a trace 42 years earlier, just before they were to be married. The mine's unique chemistry and the extremely concentrated copper vitriol in the water had mummified him, preserved him in a vacuum of time, and kept him young, while Margaret had aged a whole lifetime waiting for him. But the darkness of the story doesn't end there. When Mats was carried up into the daylight, the chemical magic began to break. The body began to slowly petrify, dry out, and crumble before the eyes of the terrified onlookers. Instead of being given a dignified burial, his body was turned into a macabre spectacle. It is said that this desecration of his remains meant his spirit never found rest. Still today, when the shadows grow long around Morten Skinner's shaft, visitors report a lonely figure. A young man in 17th century clothing has been seen wandering the shafts with a gaze filled with confusion and grief. He seems constantly to be searching for his Margaret, unaware that she died an old woman hundreds of years ago, while he remained trapped in the mountain's eternal, icy embrace. He is a prisoner between two worlds, a young man who never got to experience his wedding day and who refuses to realize that the time he belonged to has crumbled to dust. But Mats is not alone in the darkness. In the Falun mine, the mine wife is not just an old legend or a story for tourists. She is an unwritten law, a force that demands total submission. For centuries, she has been the true mistress of the mine, and those who work down here know that every step they take is by her grace. She is often described as a stately, almost otherworldly beautiful woman in a magnificent dress, but her attire carries a vital message. If she appears in white, it is said she is in good spirits, and the ore will flow. But woe to the unfortunate soul who meets the mine wife dressed in black. Black is the color of death and catastrophe, and to see her thus is an omen that the mountain is preparing to take a life. A terrifying testimony from the early 1900s tells of an experienced foreman working late one evening to inspect a remote drift. In the pressing silence, he suddenly heard 3 loud, metallic knocks from within the rock wall itself, 3 sharp blows that cut through the dark. He froze. He knew exactly what it meant. It was the mine knock, the mountain's own warning system. When he slowly turned around, he saw a female figure in a sweeping black dress silently glide past at the end of the passage before being swallowed by the shadows. Without hesitation, he threw down his tools and ran, lungs burning, toward the nearest lift. Only minutes after he reached the surface and caught his breath, the ground shook from a massive, rumbling collapse. The passage he had just left was now completely obliterated under tons of stone. But the mine wife is far from always a merciful protector. She is said to be obsessed with the mountain's treasures and jealously guards every grain of copper. Old stories tell of fortune seekers who tried to smuggle out ore, or workers who showed a lack of respect by swearing or shouting in her halls. Several of them have been found lifeless, with broken necks at the bottom of the deepest shafts. Accidents that could never be explained, as they occurred in places where it was impossible to trip or fall by chance. It is as if an invisible hand simply picked them up and dropped them into the abyss. Even in our modern age, with electric lights and safety regulations, reports continue to stream in. Guides who work daily in the mine often speak with lowered voices about the invisible worker. On repeated occasions, staff have heard the distinct sound of heavy ore carts rolling and screeching against rails in parts of the mine where all rails were torn up over 100 years ago. But the most personal discomfort arises in the Kreutz shaft. There, lonely walkers have heard the sound of heavy, strained breathing right behind their own necks, so close the hairs on their necks stand up, even though no one is there. A visitor recently told of an experience that left her in tears. In the middle of a guided tour, when the whole group stood perfectly still and silent, she felt a sudden, intense cold envelop her. In the same second, she heard a hoarse, male voice whisper, "Help me," in an old-fashioned Dale-Carlian dialect directly into her ear. When she turned around, only the cold, damp rock wall was there, a mute witness to a suffering that refuses to die. The most ominous place is the Great Pit, Stora Sturten, the enormous open-cast pit created during the gigantic collapse on Midsummer's Day, 1687. It was a miracle that no one died, since it was a public holiday, but legend says it was an offering to the mountain. Since then, the place has been a magnet for dark events. People standing at the edge of the deep hole have testified to an inexplicable lure to jump, as if voices from within the darkness are calling them. Shadows have been seen moving along the steep cliff walls, figures that cannot be human. The Falun mine is a wound in the earth that has never truly healed. Beneath the red cottages and the idyllic streets of Falun stretches a dark network of passages where the sun has never shone. It is a place where the past refuses to die. If you ever take a guided tour there, stay close to the group. Do not look into the closed-off drifts. And if you hear 3 knocks in the wall, run. Do not look behind you. Because in the Falun mine, you are never as alone as you think. We have now traveled through miles of dark passages, from the silver-glinting labyrinths of Sala to the blood-red shafts of Falun. 2 places that on the surface are historical monuments, but in their interior carry wounds that never heal. What we have heard tonight is more than just ghost stories. They are echoes of a reality where man challenged the mountain and lost. The cold gaze of the mine wife, the eternal waiting of White Karin, and the fate of Fat Mats remind us of an uncomfortable truth, that some doors should never have been opened, and some depths should never have been explored. As you shut down this video, think of the thousands of men who are still down there, those who never saw the sun again, and those whose souls became part of the stone itself. In Sweden, history does not rest in books. It rests in the darkness beneath our feet. If you ever find yourself by one of these shafts and feel a sudden, inexplicable cold, or if you hear a faint, rhythmic tapping from the underground, do not turn around. It is only the mountain wanting to remind you that it never forgets, and that it is never, ever completely empty down there. Thank you for joining Bedtime Chillers Into the Depths. If you have your own experiences from Sweden's mines, or if there are other places you want us to investigate, write it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next dark chapter. And remember, what is in the darkness is there even when you turn on the light. Sleep well.